The catapult arm groans. Ropes strain against counterweights heavy as horses, but in the sling lies something that is not stone. It is October 1346. Outside the walls of Caffa, the Mongol commander Janibeg is about to make a decision that will kill more human beings than any weapon in history. The catapult releases. A shape arcs against the grey sky. It tumbles wrong, limbs splaying, fabric streaming like a tattered flag. On the walls, a Genoese merchant watches it fall. He expects a boulder. Instead, the impact is wet. The corpse strikes the cobblestones 30 feet away, and even from this distance, the merchant sees the thing that makes his blood freeze. Black swellings, the size of eggs, clustered at the neck and groin. Buboes. The body is not just dead, it is plague dead. And then another corpse arcs over the wall. Then another, then 100 more. The Mongols aren't just besieging the city anymore. They are throwing their own rotting dead into the streets. They are turning their casualties into ammunition. It was the first act of biological warfare in history. And the consequences would be apocalyptic. Because when the ships fled this city, they didn't just carry refugees. They carried the Black Death. Within 4 years, half of Europe would be erased from existence. All because of what happens here, on this day, outside these walls. This is the story of the Siege of Caffa, the story of how biological warfare was born, the story of how the dead were made to kill the living, and the story of how one desperate act of medieval savagery unleashed the greatest catastrophe in human history. Before the first body flew, the fate of the world rested in the hands of 2 men who despised each other. Janibeg Khan was the ruler of the Golden Horde. A descendant of Genghis Khan, he was a man of sudden rages and deep grudges. He didn't just want to conquer the Genoese merchants, he wanted to erase them for insulting his tax collectors. Standing on the walls was Giovanni di Piacenza, a wealthy Italian notary. He was the man who would witness the apocalypse. His diary is the only reason we know what happened inside the city. He watched the world end and wrote it down. But the man who would actually spread the horror was Captain Domenico. A veteran sailor, he commanded one of the ships that fled the siege. He thought he was saving his crew. He didn't know that in the cargo hold beneath his feet, rats were carrying a passenger deadlier than any Mongol arrow. By saving his ship, he was dooming Europe. And finally, there was Toktai, the siege engineer. He was a man of science who knew exactly how much force it took to crush a wall. But on that cold October day, he received an order that defied all logic. He was told to stop loading stones and start loading his own dead friends. He obeyed. And in doing so, he became the architect of the Black Death. Now you need to understand how the siege began. To understand why Caffa died, you have to understand who killed it. The Golden Horde wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature. They ruled from Russia to the Black Sea with a simple motto: submit or die. Cities that resisted, like Baghdad and Nishapur, were erased. Pyramids of skulls were left as warnings. Standing in their way were the Genoese, the bankers of the medieval world. From their fortress city of Caffa, they controlled the end of the Silk Road. Through these gates flowed Chinese silk, Russian furs, and thousands of slaves. The Genoese thought they were safe behind their limestone walls. They thought their money protected them. They were wrong. The war started over a street fight. In a nearby trading post, an argument between an Italian merchant and a Mongol tax collector turned violent. The tax collector ended up dead. Killing a representative of the Khan wasn't a crime, it was a declaration of war. Janibeg Khan demanded the killer, the Genoese refused. That was the mistake. Janibeg didn't just want justice, he wanted the city. He marched his army south, driving refugees ahead of him like cattle, straight towards the gates of Caffa. The siege had begun. The Mongol army arrives in the autumn of 1343. From the walls of Caffa, the defenders watch them come. First, the dust. A brown haze rising on the northern horizon, visible for hours before the source appears. Then the sound, a rumble that grows and grows until it becomes a roar, the thunder of tens of thousands of hooves striking earth in unison. Then the army itself. The Mongol force numbers somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 soldiers. The sources disagree, and medieval chroniclers were notorious for exaggerating enemy numbers. But even the lower estimate represents a terrifying concentration of military power. For every defender on Caffa's walls, there are perhaps 20 Mongols in the siege lines. They are a study in organized devastation. The heavy cavalry forms the core. Armored riders on armored horses, carrying lances and composite bows, capable of charging at full gallop while loosing arrows with deadly accuracy. Behind them come the light cavalry, faster, more mobile, perfect for scouting and harassment. Behind them, the infantry, Chinese engineers, Tatar auxiliaries, slave soldiers from a dozen conquered peoples, and the siege train. Massive wagons carrying disassembled trebuchets and catapults, ladders and rams, all the terrible machinery of medieval siege warfare. Janibeg establishes his command post on a rise overlooking the city. From his position, he can see everything. The double walls of Caffa, the harbor crowded with Genoese galleys, the rooftops of a city that has defied him. He sends the traditional demand for surrender. The Genoese refuse. The siege begins. Caffa's defenses are formidable. The inner wall rises 40 feet, built from limestone blocks quarried from the Crimean hills. It is thick enough that 2 wagons could pass each other on its width. Towers, project at regular intervals, allowing defenders to pour crossbow fire down onto anyone approaching the base. The outer wall, lower, thinner, but still substantial, creates a killing zone. Any attacker who breaches it faces a deadly gauntlet before reaching the main fortification, and the Genoese know how to defend. The crossbowmen of Genoa are among the most feared soldiers in Europe. Their weapons, heavy steel crossbows, mechanically cocked, firing bolts capable of penetrating armor at 200 yards, turn the approaches to Caffa into a killing field. Wave after wave of Mongol assault crashes against the walls and breaks. Janibeg tries everything. Siege towers, massive wooden structures designed to roll up to walls and disgorge soldiers directly onto the battlements, are built and pushed forward. Genoese incendiary bombs set them ablaze. Sappers dig tunnels beneath the walls, hoping to collapse sections through undermining. Genoese counterminers intercept them underground, fighting vicious battles in cramped darkness. Direct assaults are launched, again and again. Ladders go up. Ladders are pushed down. Bodies pile at the base of the walls. Winter comes. The siege continues. Inside the city, conditions deteriorate. Food stores dwindle. The harbor remains open. Ships can still come and go. But supplies become irregular. The population swells with refugees from Tana and smaller colonies, straining resources further. Giovanni di Piacenza, watching from somewhere within the city, notes the growing desperation. He observes the rationing of grain, the slaughter of horses and dogs for meat, the quiet deaths of the elderly and the very young who cannot survive on reduced rations. But the walls hold. Spring arrives. The Mongol army, battered, frustrated, depleted by months of failed assaults and the slow attrition of siege warfare, begins to waver. Disease has crept through their camps, as it always does when large armies concentrate in unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhus, the ordinary killers of medieval warfare. And then, something else. Reports reach Janibeg of a strange sickness spreading among his men, different from anything his shamans have seen before. Soldiers who develop lumps under their arms, in their groins. Lumps that grow and blacken. Soldiers who burn with fever and cough blood. Soldiers who die within days of the first symptoms. The plague has arrived. but no one knows what it is. No one understands that these deaths are the beginning of something far worse than any siege. In the spring of 1344, Janibeg makes a decision. His army is weakened. The walls have not broken. He orders a withdrawal. The Mongols retreat. Inside Caffa, the defenders celebrate. They have survived. The impossible odds, the endless assaults, the winter of starvation, they have endured it all. They do not know that this is only the intermission. For a year, Caffa breathes. Ships arrive with food. Merchants resume trading. The damage to walls and buildings is repaired. The dead are buried, the wounded treated, the refugees settled into whatever spaces can be found. Life, that stubborn force, continues. But the Genoese are not naive. They know Janibeg. They know his pride. They know he will return. The city prepares. The walls are reinforced. New towers are constructed. Crossbow stocks are replenished. Food is stockpiled. Salted meat and dried fish, grain and hardtack, enough to survive another siege. The harbor defenses are strengthened, ensuring that the sea lifeline remains open, and the Genoese send word to Genoa itself, requesting reinforcements. Ships, soldiers, supplies, whatever can be spared. Some help arrives, not enough. The Republic of Genoa is fighting its own wars, an endless rivalry with Venice, conflicts with other Italian city-states, the complex chess game of Mediterranean politics. Caffa is important, but it is not the only piece on the board. The defenders make do with what they have. Giovanni di Piacenza, in his later account, describes this period as a time of tense normalcy. Markets reopened. Churches held services. Children played in streets still scarred by Mongol incendiary attacks. People tried to believe the worst was over. It was not. Far to the east, the plague was spreading. Modern epidemiologists believe the Black Death originated somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in the marmot populations of the Mongolian steppes, possibly in the trade cities along the Silk Road. By the early 1340s, it had reached the territories of the Golden Horde. Mongol armies, with their vast movements across the steppes, became perfect vectors for spreading the disease. The plague traveled with merchants, it traveled with armies, it traveled with the rats that infested caravans and ships and granaries, and in 1345 it arrived in force at the camps of the Golden Horde. Janibeg, planning his return to Caffa, watched his army die. The Mongols come back in the spring of 1346, but they are different. The army that arrives outside Caffa's walls is smaller than before, perhaps half the size of the original force. Months of plague have decimated its ranks. Veteran commanders have died. Elite units have been reduced to skeleton crews, and the dying continues. From the walls, the Genoese observers note something strange about the enemy camp. There is less activity than expected, fewer patrols. An unusual number of funeral pyres burning on the horizon, plumes of greasy smoke rising day and night, carrying the stench of burning flesh on the wind. Inside the Mongol lines, a catastrophe is unfolding. The plague moves through the army like fire through dry grass. It does not discriminate between ranks. Common soldiers die next to generals. Siege engineers die alongside cavalrymen. The shamans, who are supposed to cure the sick, fall ill themselves. Their prayers and potions useless against an enemy no one can see. The symptoms are horrifying. It begins with fever, headaches, a sense of weakness and exhaustion. Within a day, the buboes appear. Swellings in the lymph nodes, usually in the groin, the armpits, the neck. The swellings grow to the size of eggs, sometimes larger. They turn black as the tissue dies. The pain is excruciating. Then comes the bleeding. Victims cough blood. They vomit blood. Blood seeps from their eyes and ears and beneath their skin, creating the dark blotches that will give the disease its name. Most die within 3 to 5 days. Some die faster. A few, perhaps 1 in 10, recover, left with scarred lymph nodes and a strange immunity. In the Mongol camp, there is no understanding of what is happening. Medieval medicine has no concept of bacteria, no knowledge of transmission vectors. The shamans speak of evil spirits. The Muslim advisors in Janibeg's court speak of divine punishment. The Chinese physicians speak of imbalanced humors and poisoned air. None of them can stop the dying. Janibeg faces an impossible situation. His army is melting away. Every day brings more deaths. He cannot assault the walls. His force is too weakened. He cannot maintain a siege indefinitely. The plague will destroy what remains of his army before the Genoese ever run out of food. But he cannot retreat. Not again. Not with his pride at stake. Not with the insult to his tax collector still unavenged. And so, in desperation, Janibeg listens to a suggestion that will change history. If you appreciate stories like this, stories that dig into the darkest corners of history and shine a light on the moments that shaped our world, then you're in the right place. Here at Not Nostalgic History, we don't just tell you what happened, we make you feel it. We put you on those walls, in those trenches, in the minds of people facing impossible choices. If you're not already subscribed, take a moment to join us. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell so you never miss a video. And if this story is gripping you, drop a comment below. Tell us what you think Janibeg should have done. Could he have won this siege without resorting to what comes next? We read every comment and we want to hear your thoughts. Now let's return to Caffa, because the darkest chapter is about to begin. The idea comes from someone whose name is lost to history. Perhaps a shaman, desperate to find some meaning in the endless dying. Perhaps a general, looking for any tactical advantage. Perhaps Janibeg himself in a moment of dark inspiration. Whoever suggests it, the logic is grimly simple. Medieval medicine believes disease spreads through miasma, foul vapors, corrupt air, the stench of decay. The plague, according to this theory, travels on the wind. It enters through the nose and mouth. It poisons the body from within. If this is true, then the bodies of plague victims are weapons. Their corrupted flesh produces the very miasma that spreads the disease. To bring plague into a city, one need only introduce enough dead bodies. The miasma will do the rest. The catapults can launch stones over the walls of Caffa. Why not corpses? Janibeg approves the plan. The order goes out to the siege engineers. Toktai and his colleagues, the men who have spent their lives perfecting the mathematics of destruction, are told to modify their machines. The trebuchets are recalibrated. The counterweights are adjusted. The slings are redesigned to cradle a different kind of payload, and the bodies begin to accumulate. In the plague-ravaged camps, death provides no shortage of ammunition. Soldiers who fall to the disease are no longer burned or buried. They are collected, loaded onto carts, transported to the siege lines. The stench is overwhelming. Imagine it, the smell of decomposition, sweet and rotten, thick and cloying, mixed with a sharper tang of burst buboes and congealed blood. The Mongol soldiers who handle the corpses tie cloths over their faces, but the smell penetrates everything. It clings to clothes, to hair, to skin. Men vomit as they work. Some refuse the duty and are executed for disobedience. Toktai's crews work through the night. The trebuchets are prepared. The first corpses are loaded into the slings, and on a day in early October, 1346. The exact date is uncertain. Lost in the fog of medieval record-keeping, the machines are activated. Giovanni di Piacenza is on the walls when it begins. He describes it in his account, the only eyewitness record that survives. His words, written months or years after the fact, still carry the weight of trauma. He sees the catapult arms rising. He expects stones. What comes instead makes him doubt his own eyes. The bodies arc through the air, tumbling, spinning, limbs splayed at unnatural angles. They seem to move slowly, hanging against the grey sky, defying gravity for long seconds before the inevitable descent. Then the impacts. The sound is unlike anything the defenders have heard, not the sharp crack of stone on stone. Something wetter, softer, worse. The bodies shatter on impact. Limbs tear loose. Internal organs burst. Black fluid, blood mixed with the suppurated contents of ruptured buboes, sprays across cobblestones and walls and the horrified defenders nearby. And the smell. Giovanni describes it as the smell of hell itself, rotting flesh and disease, concentrated and hurled directly into their midst. The catapults continue firing. All day the bombardment continues. Corpse after corpse arcs over the walls. Some land in the streets. Some crash through rooftops into houses where families cower. Some fall short, slamming against the walls themselves and sliding down in grotesque heaps. The defenders do not know what to do. They try to remove the bodies. Work crews are organized, men with hooks and carts, tasked with collecting the dead and disposing of them. But where? The harbor? The sea? Outside the walls? Every option is dangerous. Handling the corpses exposes the workers to whatever evil emanates from them. Burning the bodies fills the air with foul smoke. Leaving them to rot spreads the miasma further. And still the catapults fire. By nightfall of the first day, dozens of corpses litter the streets of Caffa. By the end of the first week, there are hundreds. The stench permeates everything. It seeps into food stores, tainting bread and meat. It fills the churches where people pray for deliverance. It haunts the dreams of children who will never be innocent again. And then the dying begins. The first case appears within days of the bombardment. A dock worker, a man in his 30s who had helped dispose of the catapulted corpses. He develops a fever. He complains of headaches, of fatigue, of a strange pain in his groin. By the second day, the swelling is visible, a lump beneath the skin growing rapidly, turning from red to purple to black. By the third day, he is coughing blood. By the fourth day, he is dead. His family follows within a week. His neighbors within 2 weeks. The plague spreads from the harbor district inward, a wave of death moving through the narrow streets and crowded tenements of Caffa. The city descends into chaos. Inside the walls, the social fabric, already strained by 3 years of siege, begins to disintegrate. The physicians are helpless. They bleed patients and prescribe herbal remedies and burn aromatic substances to purify the air. But nothing works. The disease kills with democratic efficiency. Rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful. The hospitals overflow. Bodies accumulate faster than they can be buried. The churches offer no comfort. The priests, those who have not fled or fallen ill themselves, preach that the plague is God's punishment for sin. Confessions are heard through barriers, the priests terrified of breathing the same air as the dying. Last rites are administered from a distance. Some priests abandon their posts entirely, their faith shattered by the horror. Fear becomes the dominant emotion. Neighbor turns against neighbor. Anyone showing symptoms is shunned, sometimes dragged from their homes and thrown into the streets to die alone. Families lock themselves in houses, refusing to open doors for any reason. The markets close. Commerce stops. Food distribution collapses, and still the Mongol catapults hurl their terrible cargo. Giovanni di Piacenza describes scenes that defy belief. He writes of streets where the dead lie unburied for days, their bodies blackening in the sun, rats feeding on their flesh. He writes of houses where entire families have died, their corpses discovered only by the smell. He writes of children orphaned, wandering dazed through a city of death, calling for parents who will never answer. He writes of the sound, not the sound of battle. The siege assaults have largely stopped, the Mongol army too weakened by its own plague casualties to mount serious attacks. The sound of dying. Moans and screams and prayers, echoing through streets where no one comes to help. and he writes of escape. Some people try to flee. They crowd the harbor, offering fortunes for passage on any ship willing to sail. The ship captains hesitate. They know something terrible is happening. They fear carrying the sickness to other ports. But money speaks louder than fear. Domenico di Tana is among those who agree to sail. His galley loads passengers and cargo through the chaos of early November 1346. He sees the disease everywhere, in the faces of the people boarding his ship, in the rats scurrying along the docks, in the general atmosphere of dread that hangs over the harbor like a fog. He knows some of his passengers may be sick. He knows this voyage is a risk. But what choice does he have? Stay and die, or sail and hope? He orders his crew to cast off. As Caffa shrinks on the horizon, Domenico cannot know that he carries the end of the world in his cargo hold. The 12 ships that flee Caffa in November of 1346 fan out across the Black Sea. Some head for Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital that guards the passage between Black Sea and Mediterranean. Some head for other Genoese colonies, Trebizond, Soldaia, the scattered outposts that dot the coastline. Some head directly for Italy, their captains preferring the long voyage to the uncertainty of intermediate ports. All of them carry passengers no one invited. The rats, the fleas, the bacteria. Yersinia pestis does not care about medieval politics. It does not care about Mongol-Genoese conflicts or trading rights or questions of honor. It is a simple organism with a simple purpose: reproduce and spread, and the fleeing ships provide the perfect vehicle. Domenico di Tana's galley is typical. Within days of leaving Caffa, sailors start dying. The symptoms are unmistakable. The same fever, the same buboes, the same hemorrhaging that had consumed the city they fled. Domenico orders the sick confined below decks. He orders the crew to avoid contact with them. He orders prayers and fasting and all the remedies medieval medicine recommends. Nothing helps. By the time the ship approaches Messina, on the northeastern corner of Sicily, more than half the crew is dead or dying. The survivors are exhausted, traumatized, desperate. They make port in early October. The harbor master of Messina, a careful man, suspicious of ships from the east, notices immediately that something is wrong. The sailors who appear on deck are haggard, sick, barely able to handle the lines. Some collapse as they work. Others are already dead, slumped where they fell. He orders the ships expelled. The Genoese vessels are driven from the harbor, but it is already too late. The fleas have jumped to shore. The rats have scurried down the mooring lines under cover of darkness. The infection is loose in Sicily. Within 3 days, people in Messina begin dying. The pattern is identical to Caffa. The fever, the buboes, the bleeding, the death usually within a week of the first symptoms. The authorities try to respond. They close the city gates. They burn the possessions of the dead. They pray and process through the streets, begging God for mercy. Nothing works. From Messina, the plague spreads with terrifying speed. It reaches Catania within weeks, then Syracuse, then Palermo. By December of 1346, all of Sicily is dying, and the ships keep sailing. Genoese vessels, some from the original Caffa fleet, some that have picked up the infection at intermediate ports, carry the plague to mainland Italy. They reach Genoa in January of 1347. They reach Venice. They reach Pisa and Livorno and every major port along the Italian coast. From Italy, the disease spreads overland. It crosses the Alps into Germany and Austria. It spreads along trade routes into France. It reaches Barcelona and Madrid. It reaches England, Weymouth, in June of 1348, then London by autumn. By 1350, the Black Death has touched every corner of Europe, from Portugal to Poland, from Norway to Greece. It has killed between 25 and 50 million people, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. The map of the plague's spread reads like the map of medieval trade. It follows the routes of commerce, the sea lanes, the river valleys, the roads between major cities. Every connection that links Europe together becomes a conduit for death, and every trace of the plague's path leads back to one place: Caffa. Janibeg never conquered Caffa. His army, ravaged by the same plague he had used as a weapon, finally withdrew sometime in late 1346 or early 1347. The exact date is uncertain. What is certain is that the siege ended not in victory, but in mutual exhaustion. The Mongol forces retreated across the steppes, carrying the plague with them. The disease devastated the Golden Horde, killing perhaps a third of its population. Janibeg himself survived. He would rule until 1357, when he was assassinated by his own son, but his power was permanently weakened. The Golden Horde would never again threaten Europe with the same force. Caffa survived barely. The city that emerged from the siege was a shadow of what had been. Its population had been halved by disease. Its economy was shattered. Its people were traumatized, haunted by memories of corpses falling from the sky. But the Genoese, with their characteristic stubbornness, rebuilt. Caffa would continue as a trading colony for another century and a half, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1475. Giovanni di Piacenza survived to tell his story. His account, the Historia de Morbo, was written sometime after he returned to Italy. It is not a long document, a few pages scratched onto parchment in medieval Latin, but it is invaluable, the only eyewitness description of what may have been the first deliberate use of biological warfare. Historians have debated Giovanni's account for centuries. Some question whether the catapulted corpses were actually responsible for the plague's spread. Modern epidemiologists point out that Yersinia pestis is primarily transmitted by flea bites, not by contact with dead bodies. The bodies themselves may have been less dangerous than the rats that infested both the Mongol camp and the city of Caffa. But this distinction, while scientifically important, is historically irrelevant. What matters is what the Mongols intended. They believed they were spreading disease through the corpses. They used the dead as weapons. The intention, the decision to weaponize the bodies of plague victims, represent a crossing of a line in military ethics, a willingness to embrace methods that the medieval world itself considered abhorrent. Whether or not the catapulted corpses were the primary vector of infection, the Mongols at Caffa invented biological warfare. The Black Death transformed Europe. The numbers alone are staggering. Between 1347 and 1351, the first wave of the pandemic, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide. Europe lost between 30 and 60% of its population. Some cities, Florence, Venice, Paris, lost half their inhabitants or more. Some villages were wiped out entirely, their populations reduced to zero, their buildings left to crumble back into the earth. The social consequences were revolutionary. The sudden scarcity of labor transformed the lives of the survivors. Before the plague, feudal Europe was a world of cheap labor and expensive land. Serfs, peasants bound to the soil, legally obligated to work for their lords, had little bargaining power. After the plague, the equation reversed. Land was plentiful. Workers were scarce. Lords who wanted their fields planted and their harvests gathered had to compete for laborers. Wages rose. Serfdom weakened. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe began to crack. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a massive uprising of common people demanding an end to feudal obligations, was directly fueled by post-plague tensions. In France and Germany, similar movements challenged the old order. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not the world that had entered it. Religious faith was shaken. The medieval church, the dominant institution of European society, had no answer for the plague. Prayers did not stop the dying. Processions and pilgrimages did not bring divine mercy. Priests died at the same rate as everyone else, sometimes faster since their duties brought them into constant contact with the sick. Some people turned to extreme forms of piety. The flagellants, groups of penitents who processed through towns whipping themselves bloody, hoping to appease an angry god, became a common sight. Others turned away from faith entirely, embracing fatalism or hedonism in the face of mass death. Anti-Semitism exploded. Jews, already marginalized in Christian Europe, became scapegoats for the plague. Rumors spread that they had poisoned the wells. In city after city, Jewish communities were massacred. In Strasbourg alone, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a single day in February of 1349. Art and literature changed. The Black Death gave birth to a new obsession with death in European culture. The danse macabre, images of skeletons leading the living in a dance to the grave, appeared on church walls and in illuminated manuscripts. The Ars Moriendi, manuals on how to die well, became popular. The cheerful optimism of earlier medieval art gave way to darker themes, to reminders of mortality, to skulls and hourglasses and wilting flowers. And the political map was redrawn. The Black Death weakened the old powers. It contributed to the decline of the Byzantine Empire, which never recovered its pre-plague population. It destabilized the Mongol Khanates, which fragmented further in the disease's wake. It helped end the 100 Years' War. Periodic plague outbreaks made sustained military campaigns impossible. New powers rose to fill the vacuum. The unified nation-states of early modern Europe, France, England, Spain, emerged in part because the plague had cleared away the old feudal structures that impeded centralization. The world we inhabit today, a world of nation-states, of individual rights, of capitalist economies, of secular institutions, was shaped in part by the catastrophe that began at Caffa in 1346. What does Caffa teach us? The most obvious lesson is also the most chilling: biological weapons work. The Mongols at Caffa may not have understood the science of disease transmission, but they understood that corpses could spread sickness. And they were right. Whether directly, through the fleas that still clung to the dead, or indirectly, by accelerating the breakdown of sanitation and morale within the city, the biological bombardment contributed to the outbreak that killed half of Caffa's population and set the stage for the plague's spread to Europe. For 7 centuries, that lesson has haunted military strategists. The Japanese program of biological warfare in World War II, Unit 731, which experimented on prisoners and dropped plague-infected fleas on Chinese cities, drew inspiration from the medieval precedent. The Cold War biological weapons programs of the United States and Soviet Union, producing anthrax and smallpox and a dozen other horrors, were the industrial-age descendants of Janibeg's catapults. And the fear of bioterrorism today, of weaponized pathogens released in subways or water supplies, is the latest chapter in a story that began at Caffa. The siege reminds us that the line between acceptable and unacceptable violence is always contested. Medieval warfare was already horrific by modern standards. Massacres of civilians were common. Torture was routine. Burning cities and slaughtering populations were considered legitimate tactics. Yet even by these standards, the catapulting of plague corpses represented a crossing of some fundamental line. Giovanni di Piacenza, describing the bombardment, clearly communicates his sense of moral outrage. This was not ordinary siege warfare. This was something different, something worse. Every age has its lines, its informal agreements about what violence is acceptable and what is beyond the pale. And every age produces people willing to cross those lines when they become desperate enough, angry enough, determined enough. Janibeg was losing his siege. His army was dying. His pride was at stake. Under those pressures, he reached for a weapon that his own contemporaries would have considered satanic. How many of our own lines would hold under similar pressure? But perhaps the deepest lesson of Caffa is about unintended consequences. The Black Death did not spread because of some grand plan. It spread because of connections, trade routes, shipping lanes, the ordinary commercial links that tied medieval Europe together. Caffa was a node in a network. It connected the Silk Road to the Mediterranean. It linked the Mongol world to the Genoese world to the broader European world. The same connections that made Caffa wealthy, that brought silk and spices and gold flowing through its harbor, also made it vulnerable to disease transmission. The plague spread along those connections. Every trade route became a death route. Every prosperous city, every bustling port, every center of commerce became a center of contagion. The most connected places died fastest. This is not merely a medieval lesson. We live in a world far more connected than Giovanni di Piacenza could have imagined. A person in Hong Kong can reach New York in 15 hours. A virus in Wuhan can circle the globe in weeks. The COVID-19 pandemic, which, as of this writing, has killed millions, followed the same logic as the Black Death. It spread along the networks of 21st century globalization, airplane routes, business travel, international tourism. The same connections that make our world prosperous make it vulnerable. Caffa reminds us that connection comes with risk. In the end, Caffa is a story about death. An estimated 75 to 200 million people died in the Black Death. Most of them never saw a Mongol. Most of them never heard of Caffa. They died in villages and cities far removed from the original siege, killed by a chain of cause and effect that stretched back to decisions made by men they never knew existed. They were farmers and merchants, priests and prostitutes, children and grandparents. They had names, families, hopes, fears. Each death was an individual tragedy, a story cut short, a potential unfulfilled. We cannot comprehend 75 million deaths. The number is too large. The human mind is not built to process tragedy on that scale. But we can try. We can remember Giovanni di Piacenza, the notary who watched corpses fall from the sky and lived to tell the story. We can imagine Domenico di Tana, the ship captain who thought he was fleeing death and instead became its courier. We can picture the anonymous dock worker in Caffa, the first victim inside the walls, dying in confusion and agony from a disease no one understood. We can try to see them as they were, not as historical data points, but as human beings caught in the machinery of catastrophe. And we can remember that history is not just about the past. The decisions made at Caffa in 1346, the decision to weaponize disease, the decision to flee on ships that carried plague, the decision to keep trading even as death spread along the trade routes. These are decisions that echo into our present. When we debate gain-of-function research on dangerous pathogens, we are debating a version of Janibeg's choice. When we weigh the economic costs of pandemic response against the need for containment, we are grappling with the same trade-offs that faced the Genoese merchants fleeing Caffa. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the Siege of Caffa rhymes with warnings about biological weapons, about pandemic preparedness, about the costs and risks of our globalized world. There is a promontory in modern-day Feodosia, the city that now occupies the site of medieval Caffa, where you can stand and look out at the Black Sea. The walls are gone. The catapults are gone. The Genoese warehouses and Mongol siege lines have long since crumbled to dust. The harbor that once bristled with trading galleys is quiet, home to fishing boats and the occasional yacht. But the sea is the same. The waves that lap against that shore are the same waves that carried Giovanni di Piacenza's account to Italy. The winds that blow across that promontory are the same winds that filled the sails of Domenico di Tana's plague ship. The gulls that circle overhead are the descendants of birds that watched corpses arc through the sky. History happened here, and history continues. The Siege of Caffa is not a closed chapter in some dusty chronicle. It is a warning written in the blood of millions about what happens when desperation meets cruelty, when connection becomes contagion, when the dead are made to kill the living. We ignore that warning at our peril. In 1346, a Mongol Khan stood outside the walls of a city he could not conquer and asked a terrible question: what if I threw my dead over their walls? The answer killed half of Europe. Today, in laboratories around the world, scientists work with pathogens far more dangerous than Yersinia pestis. Today, in cargo holds and passenger cabins, goods and people cross oceans in hours rather than months. Today, the connections that tie our world together are stronger than anything the medieval world could imagine. And today, the question that Janibeg asked, can disease be weaponized, has answers far more terrifying than anything he could have conceived. The Siege of Caffa lasted 3 years. Its consequences lasted centuries. What we do with that knowledge, how we prepare for the next pandemic, how we regulate the development of biological weapons, how we balance the benefits of global connection against its risks, will determine whether the shadow of Caffa continues to lengthen or whether we finally step out of its darkness. The corpses are no longer flying over the walls, but the catapults are always being rebuilt.